Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the Hull & Chandler Leadership Series. Hull & Chandler is a client-centered law firm providing legal services to individuals, families, businesses, and nonprofits in Charlotte, North Carolina, and throughout the Carolinas. Our award-winning attorneys help clients resolve problems and find solutions. Our firm specializes in business and contract law, employment law, civil litigation, estates, wills, trusts, personal injury, commercial real estate, and lending law, and nonprofit public charity work. If interested in learning more about our firm, please check out hullandchandler.com and schedule a consultation with one of our award-winning attorneys. The law firm of Hull & Chandler is proud to sponsor the Leadership Series, a program where Hull & Chandler attorney Rocky Cabagnat interviews local and regional leaders in the nonprofit, private, and public sectors to discuss the real-world interplay of law, business, and the social dynamics within the context of our continuously changing times. At our firm, his practice helps nonprofits stay legally compliant, avoid legal problems, and resolve legal issues when they come up. Rocky provides legal services to the nonprofit sector via the Fractional General Counsel program or by providing subscription legal services so nonprofits can always have access to quality legal counsel when they need it, whether it's to review a contract or file a lawsuit on behalf of the nonprofit. Rocky has experience in the education, which is today's topic, and working with younger people. He served as faculty at an ABA accredited law school and has served as the chief executive officer for a nonprofit that was a Head Start and Early Head Start grantee. Take it away, Rocky.
Well, thank you, Shannon. Well, welcome back to another webcast episode of the Hull & Chandler Leadership Series. I think today's topic, is really kind of probably the third in sort of this ongoing series of episodes that we've had. About a year and a half ago, we had Josh Jacobson from Next Stage Consulting, and he came out, he talked about his social equity report, which really was about the emerging Gen Z, sort of younger millennial, but definitely emerging workforce, and how firms could utilize nonprofits, not just for charity, right? Those are times like, we have our foundation and we give money out, or we sponsor, like a golf event or something like that, where his idea, his whole sort of thesis and his thing was that that for-profit firms especially could utilize nonprofits as sort of as an HR tool, right? Because what he was observing was that in this sort of emerging workforce, that values play a large role in the choices that many of the younger professional workers, where they choose to work. And so if for-profit firms were like affiliated or had agreements or something with, say, the men's shelter or some other sort of charity out there, that might serve as more of a recruitment or retention tool for those firms, right? So that was, and if you're interested in that conversation, please go to our archive, our channel on YouTube. You can find that episode there. And then the second episode we had was with then teacher, and I think he's now back into like the private sector, Arma Shinko, who also was talking about his book, and he broadcast from a classroom full of Gen Z students and talk about a little bit more about what motivates them and what workforce development in this region needs to really think about to attract and retain. But he was talking that sort of in the aggregate, right? What do economic development folks need to think about with the emerging workforce? And so if you're interested in that conversation, a good one with Arma, you can also look in our archive there at our YouTube channel. But now, adding to that, we're going to be talking with our new attorney to our firm. Well, not that new. I guess you've been here for a year now, and congratulations, Jordan Burke. And I think I'm really happy to be teammates with Jordan. She's like at the door next to me. And I think that I've learned a lot talking to her about both just labor law in general, because, I don't know everything about labor. I know a lot about, I work with nonprofits, but sometimes I'll ask her some questions about this, that, or the other. But I think her insight into this particular generation is really helpful, particularly for those of you who are associated with employers or employers who are interested in trying to, either recruit or retain this quote emerging workforce, right? And so I want to just, as I start every episode, I kind of usually we have someone from the nonprofit sector, and I usually have, what was your path to nonprofit leadership? But I kind of want to ask Jordan to just maybe introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your path to labor employment law and Hull and Chandler and kind of what you do in your practice.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jordan Burke, and I graduated in 2019. So I am kind of part of this emerging workforce. I'm not actually a Gen Zer. I think Gen Z is officially people born in 1997, 96, 97 on. I'm born in 93, so I missed the cutoff just barely. But typically when they talk about people talk about the Gen Z workforce, they mean the youngest millennials, and the Gen Z is kind of people born in the 90s. So in that sense, I do fall into this group. But my path to employment and labor law is kind of through the gateway of business law. And that is my more broad practice, is coming alongside businesses and helping them with all of their business needs, whether it's mergers and acquisitions or fundraising or doing their employment and independent contractor agreements. And so earlier on, and when I first started, and still today, I function for some of my clients as their just general business legal resource, their general counsel, outside general counsel. And so from that, especially during COVID, we got all the questions about what to do with the new COVID leave, how to structure this. And just from that kind of business side, employee side of working with businesses, I've come into dealing with a lot of employment law questions and labor law questions, and what needs to go into your employee handbooks. And I think in my very, very first year out of practice, I worked a little bit on the litigation side, and so we would see EEOC complaints and discrimination complaints, and so I got a little bit of that look at the employment side of the employee side of employment law when it had gone wrong. So that's kind of my background. Now I'm strictly transactional, but I still work with businesses on trying to stay out of litigation problems with employees.
Yeah, it seems like in many ways, like your practice, and I think we have some folks who are in the human resources profession, is that in many respects, you almost kind of can be sort of like an advisor even to just HR departments in general, because it sounds like you said just a phone call, right? Because I know like HR professionals are having to deal with very complex issues related with labor law all the time, and they're sometimes asked to make a decision that may look like practicing law, but it sounds like you can at least come in there and help advise them and make sure that they're making the right call.
Yeah, and so I guess a little bit more information on how I advise businesses if they'll come to me. We want to fire this person. What's the best way to do it? Or we did fire this person and now they're upset. Have we done anything wrong? We want to implement this new policy. Can I implement it? And that's kind of a very broad overview of how I am coming alongside businesses and helping them, take their next steps with their labor force.
Well, so you've described obviously the age cohort of Gen Z, but maybe we can, and again, we're in many respects, I mean, I know none of us are quote social scientists or anything here, but at least for those in the audience, and maybe we can, and again, audience participation is actually very much encouraged, because we want this to be interactive. Again, I don't know if I mean, one reason I want to bring up this, I don't have any of the answers. That's why we're bringing in experts and people who have got a lot of experience in the area. So feel free to chime in with questions or comments. Just unmute yourself and just hop in. So Josh Jacobs, he had that whole report, and he was kind of zeroing, and he had like characteristics of this the emerging, we'll put in quotes Gen Z work, although it's obviously, it's kind of like in the eye of the beholder. What is a Gen Z versus a millennial? But one of the things I know in his report, he said that there was a certain level of values or ideal, maybe not necessarily idealism, because that kind of has a certain connotation, but at least that many young workers don't look at their job as just a job, right? So some people in older generations are like, I'm going to get a job at the steel mill. I'm just going to raise my family, and just it's a job, right? But what he was saying in his report was that many of the emerging workforce don't see their jobs as just jobs, or sort of like maybe reflections of their own value system. Is there some merit to that, or does that resonate with you, that kind of statement from his report?
Yeah, I think there is a bit more sense of, I want to be fulfilled in what I'm doing. I want to enjoy what I'm doing. I don't want to, there's that saying, if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life.
Yeah.
And I think that's a thought that millennial generations may have had an idea of, and that would be a nice thing that could happen. And then Gen Zers came along, and that is their expectation. And I don't mean in the sense of, hey, I really like knitting, so my job has to be knitting, or I'm unhappy. They are a little bit more practical than that. Your work needs to be, you need to work, but they want some sense of feeling valued, like they're doing valuable work. If their work isn't specifically rewarding, then they're with an organization that's doing something good. And I've seen a lot of that among this generation, and they're willing to kind of search for it and move around for it. And I do think you mentioned about the steel worker and the thought of, I need to take care of my family. This is my own kind of observation, but with people delaying having families longer and longer, if you're in your 20s, you're not really responsible financially for someone outside of yourself. You feel a little bit more liberty to say, okay, I have 3 roommates, I can take a little bit of a pay cut to search around. It's not like I have mouths to feed other than my own, it's still something, but it's a lot less of a burden, I think, that feel than perhaps previous generations, and especially the generation, it's Gen X, boomers before millennials, those generations.
Yeah. No, I think that's an interesting take, because that is something that maybe is not discussed a lot, but you're absolutely correct in that, the younger generation is kind of postponing, like marriage, postponing families for whatever reason. And there are a lot of different, reasons for that. But I think from an HR perspective, it sounds like normally, it's like, how am I going to, it's almost like the NBA or something, like, like, how do I recruit this free agent where they can almost kind of go anywhere else, because it seems like they're more mobile in that regard. So it's almost like coming up with strategies that are more carrot, less stick, as far as like, maybe at least as far as retention goes. And obviously you never use a stick to recruit, that's kind of absurd, but it sounds like that's that's important. So tell me, if I'm an employer and I'm looking to try to and sort of like and I have this idea of your employment, like, here's your job description and here's your entry pay, and you get X amount of days off and all of this, I sort of, maybe I have like a sort of basic sort of traditional model of just employer and employee. Where are the areas that you see that may have conflict, or at least not be necessarily in congruence between sort of the traditional employer-employee model and sort of like the motivations, ambitions of the emerging workforce?
Yes. Okay. So just to make sure I'm understanding, you're wondering where, say, an employer's might be a traditional employee-employer relationship might be, you maybe come in, you pay your dues, you'll work your way up, or
just maybe just some anecdotes or something where you've seen, maybe even in your own just friend group or something, or just where did it clash? Maybe just like where have been the clashes that have happened where I left this job because of X. What are some examples of X?
So I have seen a lot of mobility, and my friends, moving around during the Great Resignation last year, this year, before. And I will say this kind of side statement. There is this idea about Gen Zers and millennials that they don't want to work hard. And I'll say that that's not what I've seen. And a lot of my friends are, high performing people who are working in finance, and they might move from one finance position to another finance position, or one computer analyst position to another IT, like other position, and they work very hard. And a lot of the lateral movement I've seen has been, there's obviously salary. There's growth, and for whatever reason, a lot of people are able to grow more moving horizontally moving to a higher up position in the company next door, rather than just going up within their own company.
When you say salary, are you talking about like entry salary or salary scale is what kind of changes things, or what, or just salary in general?
Just salary. If you have a job offer that's paying you more dollars, they'll move for that. And especially if they can retain the quality of life that they're having. I haven't seen people move quite as much. There's not a lot of willingness to sacrifice, particularly in this generation, quality of life. I actually saw a statistic that around 60% of Gen Zers would leave a job if it started interfering with their quality of life and in a permanent material. Like, obviously there's seasons, but I've had friends who are in accounting who they get to a really hectic season and then they kind of exit that season. But if it stayed like that, they wouldn't stay in their job. And I think a big trend what people feel when they're overworked, if they look up and they see, I'm working 6 to 7 days a week all day, you need to hire another person to get this work done, but you're unwilling to do that. So you're more willing to burn me out than to hire another person. And it's not an unwillingness to work, it's an unwillingness to die to work. And I think that's what you're seeing more among a lot of Gen Zers, is they're just like, my job, they will, if I don't feel like they care about me on a personal level at all, then it's not that I don't care about them, but I just feel a lot less inclined to, I'm not going to die for this person, for this organization that would get rid of me the second they needed to. Even if the person firing you feels bad about it, it's still, that's the way it is. And particularly when there's other places to go. If we're in a market where you just don't have options, then employers can afford to be a little bit more, this is the way it is, take it, leave it, move out the door. But right now in this labor market, people have options. And even with the economy, up and down, we don't know what it's going to do. In a labor market like Charlotte, they still have, those options are still available, even if maybe that's not going to be the case across the country. That is the case in Charlotte.
That's interesting. So yeah, I want to just because I heard the term quality of life. I think that's something that's sort of a new thing that I've heard. Well, I mean, not new in the sense I've been reading about this stuff, but as like obviously the boomer generation, I at the war and or something and all this other stuff and on down. But and I think it's what I guess really, and maybe this is just sort of a rhetorical question, but hopefully some answers, like, why is a quality of life so important? I mean, maybe is there like a reason or some experiences or just some people say it's like just seeing their parents struggle through the 2008 recession or something. I don't know. There's a lot of, maybe there's economic reasons or something, or just maybe there's a spiritual reason for why quality of life is a deal breaker for a job where maybe it's not for maybe other generations.
Yeah, I think if we look back at look at the millennial generation and their statistic that it's the loneliest generation, and let's say they're having families later and later on, so they don't have maybe a family at home, but they also don't have time to build relationships. And that's just mean, not to get too philosophical, but a human need. It's in our nature
Right.
to need community, to need good relationships that are beyond just surfaceful, and you need time to build those relationships. There's health and mental health, and I think, like, take the legal profession. It's generally known that it's a problem. It's a profession that has a lot of substance abuse, which we associate with, mental health problems and stress at work. And so this generation, I think, when they're looking at quality of life, they're looking at past generations that maybe, worked themselves to death, literally. And it doesn't seem quite as worth it, particularly when there's other options and other avenues, which gets into this generation's willingness to, still hustle. They might do their 9 to 5, and instead of, killing themselves, making no more money, they have a side hustle, or they have a hobby that they like to do that they can make a little bit of money doing.
Yeah.
I have friends who are, a friend who is working in marketing, and she's been there for about a decade now, I guess a little under a decade, right out of college. She makes over 6 figures, but she knits and does nails on the side, and because that's something she likes to do, and she can get paid to do it. So she works her 9 to 5, and she works hard, but she's not staying there trying to work until 8 or 9 at night. And I say she makes 6 figures. She lives in DC, so like 6 figures in DC is going a little less far than it's going in Charlotte. So I'd probably scale that down for Charlotte numbers. But I have friends who are in finance who I wanted, over COVID, have hobbies like mixology and learning how to, mix cocktails and things like that. And so they're finding more creative ways to meet financial needs rather than just working to the bone at their position.
What would you say the percentage of, again, spitballing here, obviously, but at least of your cohort, or at least maybe what you've read of even young professionals, right? Those who have, that have a college degree, have sort of a side hustle.
What percentage? Oh, that's a hard one. But I would say, like, right off the bat, over a quarter, which isn't everybody, but that's, I think, a lot more than past generations, at least at some point in time, whether it's, I wanted to start a business, so I did, but then I was working at, like, I was driving Ubers at night, and, or people who will, I ref a soccer team, and that pays for going out to eat. Or that's how my budget works this month, or this pays for my travel budget, and they do this thing on the side, and I'd say it's probably about a quarter. Like, I think off the top of my friends, if I think about 20 friends, I can think about 5 of them who have a side hustle.
Yeah. Well, maybe this brings us to one first, maybe potential legal issue that maybe, and I'm sure that those of the audience who are interested in sort of retention or recruitment of say the emerging Gen Z workforce, if a quarter, maybe even more, maybe less, but definitely that's a substantial number, though. A quarter.
Yeah. And, my sister, she does her paralegal work, and she paints on the side, and people commission her to do paintings, like large paintings. So
yeah. So one kind of sort of standard degree. So like when a lot of folks start work. Hold on a second here. Anyway, we just have to bear through. You know what? Hold on a second here. I'll be right back.
Well, I think I understood where Rocky was getting at, and with employees trying to do things on the side and side hustles, what the implications are for non-competes, because he said a legal issue.
That's exactly what I was talking about. Sorry about that, everybody.
No, you're fine.
It's my remote day, right? It's my remote. But you're hitting the nail on the head, right? Because like when you start a job, you obviously you do your I-9 and you, all this other W-2, all this stuff, and then a lot of employers will say, okay, here's your handbook, sign, you got it. But then here's like a non-disclosure and non-compete, right? And that's just a standard thing that, or maybe it's just bunched into the personnel policy, right? The non-compete or something like that. But how do you see that potentially running against sort of like a cohort that wants, maybe not necessarily compete, but definitely is at least the potential of competition is there if you're working somewhere, but then maybe let's say like obviously in your sister situation, there may not be a lot of competition between working for a law firm and drafting complaints or helping with that and painting. But do you see some sort of like gray areas in your practice where maybe my side hustle, resembles my hustle in a sense?
Yes, absolutely. And so I'd say with the non-compete, there is two issues at play with Gen Z. One is making sure the non-compete you have is enforceable, because
Okay.
it's probably going to be more relevant than perhaps in past generations, both because people moving around and because of the side hustle. And then two is what do you need to actually protect? And so I have seen people come a lot closer than artwork and paralegal duties. And an example to not, throw any, like a made up example, that not throwing any of my actual clients under the bus, is you might have a job that details cars.
Okay.
And your employee says, you know what, I'm going to detail motorcycles. What do you do in that situation? And so going first to having your non-compete be enforceable. What I've seen from a lot of non-competes is that they will probably not be enforceable in North Carolina. North Carolina is pretty well known that they don't have a hard line scope of time or geographic distance that's enforceable, but the general rules about non-competes is that they have to be in writing, there has to be consideration, and they have to be reasonable as to time and territory, and protect a legitimate business interest. And so this protect a legitimate business interest qualification really narrows down what you can restrict an employee from doing. And a lot of times the non-compete will stop at, you can't perform services for a competitor for 2 years within 30 miles or something like that. And the geography might be reasonable. 2 years is probably going to be reasonable, but it's that broad sense of just services that North Carolina, where non-competes are not favored, they're heavily scrutinized. That broad thing of services is not going to be enforceable, because services could mean anything from, I'm performing custodial services to I'm a manager in this company. Either way, if you're working for the company, that's going to fall under services. And what makes North Carolina different from other states is a judge isn't going to look at that and say, okay, we're just going to interpret services to be reasonable. North Carolina is what's called a blue pencil district. So they're just going to strike it out altogether. So now you have no non-compete. So you're going to want to make sure that your non-compete is specific to what you're trying to restrict. So maybe you want to restrict management services or sales services or tech, whatever services are specific to what you don't want that employee to do. And then it has to be reasonable in being related to confidential information they have or skills you may have taught them. And so from moving from the enforceable side to what you do want to protect, as far as retaining this workforce, you might have to sit down and be more specific in what you're carving out. If somebody wants to branch into motorcycles and you're doing cars, maybe you allow that with the caveat of, if we decide to move into motorcycles, you have to stop working with motorcycles. Or maybe you say, you can start the motorcycle wing of our car factory and you can expand. But just saying like, we just are going to broadly say, no, you can't do motorcycles either. And that doesn't really relate to what you're doing, even though it feels like, well, they're vehicles. That's something that's going to be more of a gray area, whether you can get it. One, it's enforceable, but two, how your employee feels about your organization, whether they're going to stay.
Yeah. So it sounds like, because, like if you're, working in, say, the human resources department, you're bringing in a new worker, and it's like, you have a checklist, right? Like, okay, I give them the application, I give them the tax form, and then, did they sign this non-compete agreement? And it sounds like, at least here in the state of North Carolina, if you're an employee, that the non-competes aren't favored by the courts. So if you just pull something off the SHRM website or something, that may not necessarily be like the best particular non-compete for this situation, because it gets shot down if, assuming that you decided to enforce it and really go up the ladder to get it litigated. But it does sound like that the non-compete could be that, but it also sounds like what you're saying is that it could be an opportunity for that employer to, like you said, almost turn what the old saying, like turn a lemon into lemonade, right? Here's somebody who wants to potentially compete, but what if I convert this into like another division of my company, right? Or somehow, and that would maybe even give you more stronger consideration, because if you give them more pay to kind of do this, and then you lock them in with the because now you can't compete with me because you're doing this all other line. You're now you're now I'm now kind of like in Star Trek I'm a Borg now. I've kind of absorbed you into like our organism. I mean, that's creative thinking. That's a creative way to approach the employer, and I think that's necessary with this sort of wild card workforce, right? And I think that's a really good, I think working with someone like working with an attorney like Jordan gets you sort of, because of the understanding of the workforce and kind of things, to kind of come up with potential creative ways to kind of, again, turn a deal breaker into actually an expansion or something like that. It's really kind of an interesting interesting take there. So it does sound like, again, non-competes. If you've got a non-compete, it would be a good idea to get it reviewed, or would you say are all non-competes like case by case, or are there some places where a non-compete is pretty much like you can just have a standard non-compete?
Oh yeah, so they vary state from state. So California, your non-compete's almost never going to be enforceable, whether you have it or not. And North Carolina, they're disfavored. So, and that doesn't mean that a court won't uphold it, but they're looking at it as from the eye of, why should I enforce this? My inclination is to not enforce it. And then they have, well, if it does these guidelines, and there's no black and white rule, there's no specific, there's no rule saying 2 years is always reasonable. It's saying you have to be reasonable, and 2 years is usually considered reasonable, but sometimes 5 years might be considered reasonable, depending on the employee's role and what they know and that information. And sometimes, 1 year is going to be considered unreasonable. So, and so 1 year being unreasonable, that's almost never, probably not going to happen. But let's say you have a cashier and you don't want them to move to another store. There's no non-compete. There's no way that's going to ever hold weight. I don't think anyone would try, but that's kind of an example of when unreasonable.
Well, that's interesting. So you mentioned that California doesn't, almost like non-competes it's like just a piece of paper in California. Here, maybe it's a piece of paper. Maybe it's more than just a piece of paper. And maybe other jurisdictions, it's definitely more binding. But speaking of, say, like a jurisdiction like California, right? Obviously during COVID, a lot of people, obviously went to remote work and started to maybe move, right? Move to a whole different location, like say a state that they would have, would want to live in. And many employers, I think, became more accommodating of a more remote and multi-jurisdictional workforce, right? When I say that's almost not too legal, just like workforce and all, like in every other state but your own, right? And so like I think maybe that's an interesting and maybe this really is more than just the Gen Z workforce, right? Because I think everybody has various, every generation has like various reasons for liking remote work, but it does create a lot of complications for employers. So for example, if I have a non-compete, but I'm remoting from California, and that doesn't matter. Should I even care? Should I just go ahead and start detailing my motorcycles? Because I'm like, you ain't got nothing on me. I'm in California now.
Oh yeah. So yeah, that idea of remote working is I think at first during the beginning stages of the pandemic, it was maybe going to be this is a temporary thing. But with Gen Z specifically, this is
Mhm.
I think, like perfectly timed so
Mhm.
that the graduates coming out in 2020 were they were all Gen Z. So this is what they know. As Gen Z, the first Gen Zers to come out of college, immediately go into remote work in a pandemic. They're
Mm.
also different even from my generation, like me being a younger millennial, or one
Mhm.
of the youngest millennials. Like, I still know that through high school and most of college, like through high school, I had dial-up internet at home. There was still, don't get on the phone and internet at the same
Oh,
time.
yeah.
And
Well, yeah.
then in college, I started college and most everybody had a flip phone or a slide
Mhm.
phone or one of those things. And it was kind of my senior year when it was like, okay, everybody has a smartphone. And I
Mhm.
didn't even have a smartphone until my first year out of college. And
Mm.
even that slight difference is enough of a
Big
difference
difference.
for a Gen Zer who came through high school with a smartphone,
Mhm.
with came through college with all of these things because of the
Mhm.
way their familiarity with connecting virtually. And
Mhm.
so it was almost natural going into the workforce where they feel like, oh, I can collaborate. I can, get
Mhm.
on the phone or get on a Skype or a Zoom or FaceTime or any of the other myriad of ways people connect virtually. And it's like, it's old hat. I can voice text my paragraph to my best friend on my phone,
Mhm.
whereas previous generations, just the maneuvering of technology to build relationships is just
Mhm.
not as secondhand. It's not like breathing the way it is for someone born in Gen Z. So their
Right.
willingness to want to work remotely is very high.
Ah, yeah.
And seeing the need, because we hear about collaboration and connecting, and this is why we need you in person. And a lot of
Mhm.
times they're thinking, well, I can connect and collaborate
Mhm.
remotely. So I need something a little bit more compelling for why I need to come in.
Mhm.
So all that
And
is to say is remote working, that's one another factor that I've seen people leave jobs for or move
mhm.
jobs for is if a company is making the employee come in, not just come in one day, but if it's I want to see you here for 5 days, and
Mhm.
that there's any other number of employers that are going to say we want you in for 3 days or 2 days or one day or any other hybrid workforce, which is most everyone that they've committed to say, well, we're not going to have you come in permanently. It will be something hybrid. Great.
Mhm.
Good to see you, Megan. Sorry, I just saw her note. But
Yeah.
anyway, um, um, they they're willing to leave to
Yeah.
not to because they want to work remotely. And
Yeah.
so with that, with employers seeing like, okay, we have to adjust to having a
Mhm.
remote worker, there's also the problem of not just having them at home and the security concerns with their laptops and um,
Mhm.
making sure they have all the tech. But if they are not in your state, then that just opens up a whole other can of worms, like legal
Yeah.
ramifications.
No, I mean,
Um, and and you see it all the time. I work remotely. I wanted to move to Colorado, so I moved to Colorado for 3 months.
mhm.
Or even out of the country. I've seen people move to Spain for a little bit of time. I'm gonna try it out. Why not? I'm
Yeah,
getting
I'm in
paid.
Spain right now. Just kidding, I'm not in
I
Spain.
get an Airbnb. Oh, actually, during COVID, I had a friend who rented an Airbnb in Cabo for a
Wow.
month and then had other friends just like coming to visit periodically while he spent the month in Mexico doing work from the beach. But all of those things are
Mhm.
just like, okay, wow, but you don't think about the legal
Mhm.
ramifications of doing that. And
Right.
so and they go from the employer side of it, you are subject to the laws of the state where your
Mhm.
employee is located. And there is a kind of a test for whether you were beholden to those laws, but it
Mhm.
varies from state to state. So it might be if your employee is earning an income in the state for 2 weeks, then that state's laws apply. It might be 60
Interesting.
days, it might be 90 days. It might be a threshold dollar amount. If they earn $2,000 from the state, it doesn't matter. If they earn $10,000 from the state, it does matter. And so that's the first consideration with remote workers is how long are they in the state? Is this permanent? Is it temporary? And are they there long enough, making enough money from that state state laws touch me? If they do touch you, then you have to make sure you're meeting their minimum wage laws. You have to make sure you're meeting their sick leave laws, their vacation leave, their maternity leave, all of those things. If you have independent contractors and their test for an independent contractor is different than North Carolina's test for an independent contractor, you need to make sure that it's an independent contractor in that state and not an employee in that state. You may need to register to register to do business in the state.
Right.
For example, Tennessee, if you have an employee in that state, you need to register to do business in that state. There are countries like that. In Canada, if you have a Canadian employee, you have to be an employer of record in the province in Canada to have that employee there. There are workers' comp. Mostly you have to, or most states will require that the employee register and obtain workers' comp insurance in the state where the employee is doing the work. For employee, unemployment insurance, you have to pay that in the state where your employee is located. Jurisdictional rules. You might have an employee in Florida who thinks you've discriminated against them, and now you want to sue them, and they might be able to bring you to court in Florida because it's considered a substantial contact between you and Florida to have an employee there, and maybe you didn't know that. Then there's other concerns. For example, there was a period of time this time last year where vaccine laws were, contested, and businesses were wanting to have their COVID vaccine requirement. And let's say you have an employee in Texas or Florida, and now you're wondering, can I enforce that? My company has a vaccine requirement. Can I enforce it to my employee who lives in Florida or Texas? The answer is no. And let's say you're having this retreat in another state and everybody's coming. What happens to those employees? And so those are just considerations that there's not an answer that I could give you sitting here, because
that's a whole other episode or two.
49 places to consider.
I'll have a whole series on that. That it almost opens up like a Pandora's box of just problems, right? Because you think of your really large employers, right? Like the Bank of America's or something, which they have a branch in maybe every state, or if not, pretty darn close to every state, right? Wells Fargo, the same thing. And that means that they have capacity, they have scale to kind of do compliance at that multi-state national level. They've probably retained every major law firm in each of these jurisdictions and regions and such. But this sounds like this potential, if you're a smaller Charlotte-based employer, right? And you're trying to do the right thing, you're like, I'm going to try to be cool and let these generate different, if they want to work from Texas or California, they want to live by the bay, if they can afford something out there, or maybe they got a friend who's got something out there, Winnebago or something like that. That's cool. We'll accommodate because, right, remember, we're trying to, but then it opens up the situation where because it's HR is hard, it's hard work, and even in the state you're in, just imagine that now now you've got 7 employees living in 7 different jurisdictions, and then you've got to be on top of who's workers comp controls, or who's the unemployment controls, or non-competes.
Where do you withhold taxes?
It's you would probably have to you almost have to go with one of those large payroll companies, just for the simple fact that they probably have just the capacity to just know what the payroll is in all these different states. Do you have to have the check at a certain date, or do you have to have a check, a wage statement or something like that? It's really there's that very old cynical saying, it's like the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
But in some respects, like, yeah, go on out there, see the world, guys. We're going to be the best employer, and you can work from wherever. And then all of a sudden, something happens, and it's just, oh, what, California has like 87 different anti-discrimination statutes. I'm gonna hit you with at least 7 of them, right? So I mean, there's, it's
policies change very different in California, all of it. Yeah.
So I would say this to those of you, and again, involved in HR or employing people and are thinking about this. I'm not saying that don't do it, because I mean, again, it will help you with recruitment and retention, because it does play that quality of life thing you were saying, because we talked about that earlier in the episode. Quality of life is a big deal. If I can work, looking at, if I'm like, if I can work from San Francisco and just sit on, eat a bread bowl soup and sit there at the bench looking at the bay, doing your spreadsheets. I'd be, I don't know, maybe I'm projecting what I would do if I were in that cohort, but, I mean, but then of course you fall under the laws of employment laws of California. So it's almost like the more that you're trying to be cool about things, then you may, it may backfire on you. So then I know here in the city of Charlotte, because I've heard a lot of different folks, particularly in finance, about people coming back to the office, that idea, so Bank of America says, we at least in all this commercial space, you got to, come on guys, you got to start coming back into the office. And I know you and I had talked about maybe discussion about this sort of back to the office, I don't say a movement, but just sort of the back to the office plea. I don't know if that's a better way of describing it, but what would you say what would be sort of your advice for employers who are, maybe folks have gotten so used to remote and they like the quality of life there, but then you feel from your workflow standpoint that it may work better to bring people back in. Maybe you're just paying a lot in commercial lease, and it just, you need to justify it, is there anything we can say? Are we sort of at a stalemate of like, well, if I got to come back in the office for whatever reason, I'm out of here? What would you have to say about that?
Yeah, well, I would say, like, one, requiring people to come to the office, even if it's 1 day a week, that really helps with the remote work in other states type aspect. Because short of someone living over the line in Fort Mill, they're going to have to be in North Carolina. So that's one benefit to that. Excuse me. For requiring them or trying to get people to come back into the office, I think the one thing that I've seen, and I think I talked about this with Shannon a little bit before the talk started, was that workers really want to see a good reason for them to have to come back. The fact that you spend a lot on a corporate commercial space is probably going to be one of the less good reasons that an employee is going to see. And first, I'll talk about what I've seen, because I have friends working, in Vanguard, Dimensional, TIA, like all these other big places that are trying to recruit people back, and they're offering free lunches. They have renowned chefs from New York coming down to cook in the lunch spot. They're offering so a whole host of perks, and they're like, oh, they got a new space and it's really cool and it's like flashy. But I mean, the long and short of it is that it's really hard. That's as great as that is, it's really hard to have that compete with my dog. I don't have to go take my dog out at lunch. I can, I don't have the commute. I don't have to drive in and park and deal with traffic. I can get, throw dinner in the oven and have it cooking while I'm working, or just the convenience of working at home. It's really hard for perks that are cool to outweigh those. And so in that sense, the carrot stick is kind of it's going to be a harder push, just because it's hard. It's going to be hard pressed to have a carrot of amenities that beats out your house unless your employee is just an extrovert and they just want to see people and want to get out of the house.
It almost sounds like maybe some of these uptown employers that have like the big leases, or maybe they have these buildings, maybe they should need to build like a bunch of lofts inside those buildings and just recruit them out. Well, you know what? You want to live downtown. You want to go to the Hornets game. Here, maybe you can walk in.
So provide dog care in your building, and
yeah.
So like, I mean, and I say that kind of jokingly, but I do think like that would be a big one to get a lot of people in. It's like, oh, I can bring my puppy here, and I mean, but that's a lot bigger scale than what a lot of smaller businesses.
Or maybe just a voucher too, like a voucher to use at like a dog care that's like, high quality dog care place. Again, some of them are not great, I mean, but that's the kind of creative thinking that again, that sort of incentives, right? So so would you say like what has been the effect, or what has been the success of many of the incentives that you have seen employers employing to try to get the emerging workforce to either come work or come in the office, or I mean, are they working? Is the chef working? Is really the question. Has it yielded any benefits, or are they just
I think it benefits to the extent that you want someone to come in once a day. People know that Wednesday's a day for free work. People come in on Wednesdays. I have friends who were, I mean, this is terrible, that they're kind of like, oh, they're really good sandwiches. I get a salad to go. I collect them, and it's like my lunch and dinner for the other days of the week. But as far as if it was a permanent requirement, I haven't seen anyone have a permanent requirement, but I don't think a permanent requirement would work. I think people are too happy working from home, and it's not even the thought of just, I want to do nothing all day. It's like, I can work, if work starts at 9, I can be working out at 8:55 and then jump. It gives you an hour back of like travel in your day. It gives you the ability to do things like switch the laundry in, switch the laundry out, and just kind of stay on top of your life when, it's not the 50s where you're like a husband who has a wife at home taking care of these things. You're like, I have to take care of these things for myself. Another thing that I have seen employees want to see coming back to the office is a reason beyond, this is just kind of how I like it.
Yeah.
So if it's about collaboration, then I want to collaborate, and we have to have a meeting. If it's about having in-person meetings, then we need to have in-person meetings. If it's about, there has to be some identifiable, you need me in person to do this, and I'm in person to do this. Not just you just think it kind of be here. I come in, I go into my office, I don't talk to anybody, I don't have to do, it doesn't add anything productive. And so even if you have those reasons, and I think that like there are legitimate reasons. I have a friend who is a young millennial who at this point in her career is now managing a lot of people, and she even says things, I need to see my team members once a week so we could just get to the bottom of things, or point things out, or work things through in person. But it needs to be communicated. This is the reason why I need you to come in, and we're doing it. Because if it feels like I just have the power to make you come in, there's no real reason for it, I want you to come in, that is when people are ready to look elsewhere. And then there are some times where you have a legitimate reason to have someone come in, and they can find a job where they don't have to come in, and they're just going to move, and that's just kind of a lost employee.
Interesting.
But there is definitely, I think, a true value in coming to the table with some compromises to keep your employees, because you want to build relationships. I'm someone who, I prefer to know people than to be meeting a new person, like meeting a whole new team every year. There's again, something I was mentioning earlier is, at the least expensive level, it costs approximately 50% of your employee's annual salary to replace them at the lowest level. The higher up the employee gets, the more expensive it gets to replace them, like 9 months, double their salary or 3 or 4 times the salary to replace a high performing, high level employee. So the extent that you can make compromises to keep employees is ideal. And even if you're a smaller business and you're thinking, oh, I can't afford to pay another $10,000 a month on their salary, you think this is the position that you're replacing multiple times a year, or every year, or, you know, every 2 years even. It may be, you might have to go back and look at it with your accountant, but if you look over the course of year replacing employees, it may be financially worth your while to pay a little bit more. Even very small gestures, I think, go a long way with my generation. It's very common to see things like, my business pays my job pays my gym membership.
Yeah.
That's, you know, $60 a month or something, or my job pays for me to enter a marathon, or they paid for my Fitbit, or like health initiatives, or small things like that. I think also go away. You know, they give me 8 hours a quarter to do community work in the community. If I can show that I was doing a volunteer effort.
So that might play into like Josh Jacobson's idea about utilizing like the nonprofit sector as almost a retention recruitment tool. Like if your company has like a relationship with like a homeless shelter or something, and you know, part of your job, and you maybe get paid even during that time is to volunteer or something, you know, maybe because again, maybe that's something that you like to do, or something like that. I mean, it is an interesting, I will say this, and what I've yielded from this is that it is a strange new world in many respects.
I have a friend whose job gives everyone their birthdays off, which is, you know, 1 day of PTO. It is maybe ridiculous. Like, I think the verdict is out on that, but either way, it's something that makes them feel like my company cares about me.
Right. Because it sounds like, and this is maybe an interesting way of kind of what I'm yielding from our discussion, is that, you know, there's like the traditional model of quote work and career, like you show up, you work for free, right? A lot of people are interns, we just work for free, or we try to figure out a way in, right? And then we're trying to please, you know, the powers that be, right? You're trying to, you know, it's about, but under this new sort of, I mean, obviously you still need to perform to be able to, you know, and they're not, you know, but it does sound like employers probably need to be, at least, if not, because you know, I can see there's resistance to that, because it's like, you know, almost like, how dare you, right? You know, kind of like
a sense of everybody comes in and pays their dues. I paid my dues, you paid your dues, and that's the way.
And now this generation just wants to sit on a beach and drink a Corona with Snoop Dogg and just, you know, look at like you know, just and have a laptop. But I mean, you know, I think you know, at the end of the day, you know, the market is a market, right? And you know, if you're going to you know, if you want to attract the, you know, this particular workforce, you know, then it's almost like cultural competence, right? You know, like they say, well, if you're going to do trade in Japan, you need to learn like some of the customs of the people in Japan, or you might get kicked out the door, you know, if you say the wrong thing or do the wrong hand gesture or something like that. Maybe maybe it's a level of some kind of competence of understanding sort of the motivations, because, you know, the old saying is that, you know, you don't get anywhere with force, you get somewhere with understanding, right? It does sound, that's one of the reasons for this conversation, is hopefully we can shed more understanding about, you know, about the emerging workforce, because there's been a set of unique historical circumstances that have shaped, you know, this particular generation. I mean, it's I mean, COVID off the top of my head, but, you know, just everything from the 2016 election to the 2018 to the Iraq war to, you know, to 9/11, if some of them are even old enough to remember that, you know, that these are, you know, it's definitely, and I think that's where I'm, you know, trying to understand. But you know what, I think that's number one, you got to understand, but then you got to implement at some level, particularly if you're in the HR field, you know, because you know, you're charged with trying to, again, avoid those costs, right? We said because you said it, you know, if there's high turnover and you're always bringing somebody in, and you gotta, you know, you're doing your professional development budget, and you're always having to, you know, it becomes almost like a hamster, you know, it's like an ongoing wheel. And it's almost like, you know, firms like McDonald's or something are used to that, right? They kind of, you know, usually like, okay, plug and play kind of like, you know, workers. But you know, as you move up into sort of the professional ranks, you know, there's certain, you know, the way these reports are done, right? The way they're submitted, right? They're things that take time to kind of understand, and that turnover will just crush you. And then it's almost like in some respects, a lot of employers might be cutting off their nose to spite their face if they want to kind of stick with this, because who's going to end up doing that work that's left over when that millennial or Gen Z person goes to another job because of you not being able to.
It's not like the trend is not changing. And I think that's that's another factor. You have millennials who already kind of had this ideal, but just kind of, they're like, oh, this is what we'd like it, but this is the way it is. And then you have Gen Z who are the embodiment of that. And I don't imagine the next generation is gonna, hey, actually, I really want to work myself to death and go back to the old way. I imagine it's just the continuing trend.
So it's going to take a lot of, it sounds like there's almost like a revolution in sort of the employer, and it's not even like, it's interesting because we don't have, we're in the South particularly, and nothing, we don't have like unions or anything like, it's very, but this is a revolution. I started noticing, like with the great quote resignation, to this notion of quiet quitting or something, that there's something different going on, and whether you agree with it or not, it's there. And I think that's the point. Like any lawyer's got to give you the reality of the situation. I know you feel a certain way, but here's what you're facing. Here are the pros and cons of the approaches that you're seeking. So if you were to retain Jordan and you ask her about this move or that move HR wise, she's going to break down like the pros and cons of what's there, but she's going to bring in a lot more, a lot more of this discussion, the nuances and stuff, because nothing is ever, just like some binary, nothing is like, like that. It's they're gradations, and I think that's where, seeking, assistance in trying to kind of work through not just the legal, but because every time there's a legal problem, there's also kind of like a personal or just a system problem. It's not, legal issues don't exist by themselves. There is a context to how they kind of come up. And so I know we've kind of gone over time, but we own the platform, so we can talk as long as we want, to be honest. But I did say that I wanted this to be an interactive time. So I know Megan hopped off the call, but for those of you who are still here, feel free to jump in if you got any questions. I mean, Jordan's here. If you're having issues with retention, recruitment of emerging work, this is your opportunity to kind of ask a question or make a comment.
Sarah, do you have any questions?
I actually do have a number of questions, but it is overtime already, and unfortunately I have to go. This was really helpful, especially the conversation on the side hustles. I know the legal portion of that conversation was really focused on non-competes, but I'm curious, and I'll need to get in touch with you guys later, but I'm curious how firms can protect themselves when employees want to have side hustles and it's actually impacting their time in the office, right? They're taking off too much time, or their work is suffering around the times that they have like big craft events or something like that. So again, I have a number of questions, but I'll probably get with Shannon later to get y'all's contact information. This was very helpful. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for joining.
I agree. It's been super helpful. From our perspective at Colony. Another item Shannon would love to hear about is just as we consider remote work for certain people out of state, how we might, affect ourselves and plan appropriately ahead of time to make that as cost effective for the firm as possible.
Well, I'll follow up with you guys and try to get a call scheduled with Jordan and Rocky so you guys can get some of your questions answered.
Probably more Jordan. If you're not in a nonprofit, Jordan and me. But if you're in a nonprofit, there'd be,
Well, thank you so much for your time and expertise. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining. And thanks. I think this has been a great conversation. I know the leadership series is usually about the nonprofits, but this issue affects every sector, and this firm doesn't just do nonprofit laws. You can obviously, if you've only been seeing this webinar, it's like, do they only do is nonprofit? No, we do a lot at Hall & Chandler. And as you can tell, labor employment is definitely is a big area of our firm's practice. So again, any questions, no big or small, or obviously you don't want the EEOC or discriminate, but if that happens, we got your back on in that regard. So any other comments, anything? Jordan, any parting words of wisdom for everybody?
No, I guess my parting thought is that, there's still work to be done and work that needs to be done. And so I think the next couple of decades of work will just be everyone coming to the table to figure out what works for employers and employees together, collaboratively.
Well, and if you guys have
navigate that.
No, and again, if you have any idea, we'll definitely be following up on this, because I think this is a real important issue for Charlotte, for just working America in that regard. And so we'll continue to explore these topics and more. Hopefully, Jordan, you can maybe join us another time to give us your perspective on our leadership series. So thank you for joining us on a Wednesday in the middle of the week, because I know it's a lot to ask, but appreciate your time, and we hope to be of service to you sometime. Thank you
So much.
Bye, everyone.